Here we go. Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 13 of the Douglas Social Credit Podcast. I'm here with Dr. Oliver Heydorn again, and I'm William Waite. Today, we've decided to talk about methods for bridging the gap. So, just to give you a quick rundown on what the gap is, Douglas identified that there was a perpetual shortfall between the amount of money available for consumption in the hands of consumers and the aggregate prices coming out of industry. This shortfall in consumer buying power meant that, among other things, we're forced to continually go back to the banks and borrow more money. But there are also, because it's so essential to bridge this gap somehow, there are also other distortionary effects where we're doing things in order to make up this consumer buying power shortfall, and that's what we're going to talk about today. These different they're really palliatives. They don't solve any problems. They sort of just kick the can down the road. And we're going to talk about how we do this and perhaps what some of the negative effects of this are. So perhaps Oliver, you might start us off maybe with a list of things. Um,
Well, I think perhaps the best place to start would be to recognize that if there is this underlying recurring price income gap, that costs and prices are being generated faster than incomes in the form of wages, salaries, and dividends are being distributed to consumers. There are, in principle, two basic ways by means of which you can bridge the gap. You can find ways of decreasing price, right? Chopping off some of the price component so that the gap narrows that way. Or you can try to increase the flow of consumer buying power. And so those would be the two broad categories that
mm,
you can tackle the gap by lowering prices somehow, or by bringing up the flow of consumer buying power so it equates to prices. And the existing economic system can do both and sometimes does both simultaneously in different
mm,
ways. So, but they're not equal, right? We should point out that when it comes to lowering price, not always, but very often, that comes at very tremendous cost to the economy and to social stability, because when it comes to lowering price, we're talking about things like bankruptcies, right? If you allow a certain number of firms to go bankrupt, they liquidate their inventories, their consumer goods. And yeah, sure, consumers can buy them a lot more cheaply, but it's not good for companies to go bankrupt because then people get unemployed, the economy shrinks,
mm.
the banks can't recover loans and all this sort of stuff, right?
Yeah,
So that does happen sometimes, especially if there's been too much debt in the system and we're trying to reset the system, but then we have a financial crisis. Uh, there are other similar ways, like you could rely on private businesses to subsidize the consumer out of its own stores of capital, at least for a certain period of time, where they're basically selling below cost. So that's helping to bridge the gap, but that is not sustainable long term, because eventually, if that doesn't change, the business will go out of business. It will become bankrupt, right?
mm.
Uh, so those are two examples of lowering the price. You could also get the government to somehow subsidize business sales, right? Through some government program where the business is selling below cost, um, but there's some sort of grant or a loan or some sort of government intervention, which, within the confines of orthodox finance,
Mm.
facilitates that process. But then
Well,
you're
this
driving up.
happens. this happens in agriculture in the US and the EU, I think, quite a bit. Farm. I don't. In Australia, we're not heavily agriculture's not heavily subsidised, but just keeping farmers operating or even paying them not to grow crops and so on is a form of kind of price reduction, I suppose.
Yeah, indirectly. Yeah.
Mm,
Um, so yeah, so those are some of the ways you can handle it on the price end, but it comes at tremendous cost. So the system prefers generally to find other ways to borrow additional money into existence from the banking system to buoy up the flow of consumer buying power. And you can place those in three basic categories, right? The government can borrow and spend it on public production or public services, and thereby, increase the flow of wages, salaries, and dividends to consumers, to the consuming public, to the consuming
mm,
class. And those public goods and services are not going to be sold to the public in the same period of time. I mean, eventually we have to pay for them, but maybe we don't pay for them for several years down the road. And so it
mm.
helps, as you said before, it helps to kick the can down the road, right? And that's one reason why the government is so large and why it keeps growing, because government borrowing and running government production is one of the major ways of bridging the gap. And so this is what I think a lot of libertarians don't seem to understand, that if the government were not 30% of the public of the whole economy, um, if we drastically reduce the size of government overnight, well, how are you going to fill the gap? The private sector would have to pick up the slack.
Mm.
And so that brings us then to a discussion of businesses and consumers. Maybe you'd like to handle the consumer aspect of how that is a method of bridging the gap by increasing the flow of consumer buying power.
Yeah, well, largely this happens as a result of encouraging consumers to take on more debt. Um,
Mhm.
we've seen this. We've seen this lately in the housing market. Consumers have been consumers are basically, if you want to buy real estate, you've got these inflated prices. The banks are willing to lend to these inflated prices, and that increases consumer buying power in the economy. I mean,
Mhm.
that's probably the main way that's been going on now, or recently. There's also, of course, credit card debt and all those sort of direct consumer debt that is made available in order to get more debt into the system. Um, Student loans, I guess, is another way that is done. And then there's all this debt that's being made available for sort of trivial things. Well, not trivial, but I think there's something like $100 billion worth of car loans in Australia at the
Mhm.
moment.
It's a lot.
Um, Borrowing for holidays,
Yep.
borrowing to pay for weddings. I mean, it's just become like um, you know like layaway. They don't call it that now, but buy now, pay nothing for 2 years. It's a
Yep.
way of it's a way of clearing product now with future incomes, I suppose. And
Mhm.
there's so many versions of it now, isn't there? Because the need is so great for consumer buying power in the economy. Um, it's such a priority that there's sort of no limit to no limit to the ways in which that they can think of getting more debt money into consumers' hands. Of course, it increases the um, economic pressure down the road. I mean, this all has to be paid back at interest,
Yep.
and it sort of makes it compounds the problem as the debt grows and the debt and the interest burden grows. It's harder
Yeah.
and harder to encourage people to borrow
And the
sufficient money into existence.
that's right. And the statistics would bear this out because I don't know what it is now. But I know that, for example, in Canada, they'll say, for example, for every dollar in disposable income, the average Canadian owes maybe $1.70 or $1.75 or $1.80 or whatever it is at the present time.
Yeah.
But if you look historically over the last few decades, that has constantly been rising. I think in 1980 it was much lower. Maybe we only owed 80 cents
Mm,
for every dollar in disposable income. Then it was a dollar, then it was $1.20, then it was $1.40, then it was
mm,
$1.80. But at some point this becomes unsustainable, right? Where
mm.
people max out their credit card. We just can't borrow anymore because we can't service the debts we already have. And then of course the
And they talk
temptation
about,
to take the debt.
stagnating wages, and I mean, there's a limit to what businesses, and I suppose the government too, can afford to pay in wages. And as
Mhm.
a larger proportion of people's salaries and wages go into debt servicing, that is money not available for bridging the gap. So it's kind of like a, two steps forward, one step back kind of thing, except the one step back becomes, gets closer to taking the whole thing,
Mhm. Mhm.
if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's it it definitely creates a problem. Like all of these palliatives, they don't solve the problem at source, and they only end up uh, generating other problems down the road. And so
Mm,
it's there's a huge cost to be paid. I mean, we've got to fill the gap somehow. We've got to bridge it somehow. But none of these conventional solutions are in any way ideal or without their own set of problems. And then that leaves, of course, the private sector in terms of businesses, right? So let's say you've got a government that wants to fill the gap by encouraging business expansion,
mm,
especially capital production. Because again, with capital production, you're producing goods and services, but we're not selling it to the public, at least not in the same period of time. And so the wages, salaries, and the profits associated with that expansion can help to fill the gap. So you might have a situation where it's like we've got to grow the economy. We've got to
yeah,
create incentives for businesses to expand. If they can, one of the ways, probably the best way of doing that, is to encourage what is often termed a favorable balance of trade. Right? It's favorable in financial terms, but it's not favorable in physical terms. Because what you're doing there is you're trying to fill the gap by exporting some of your surplus and not replacing it with, in full anyway, with imports, right? You export more than you import. So those companies that are exporting, they're having their salaries, their wages, their profits that's can be used domestically to bridge the gap. And you're also getting rid of some of the production that would otherwise have to be sold domestically,
mm,
right? And that creates a situation then where you've got all these countries that are vying, involved in trade wars, trying to get the upper hand over other countries because they all have this domestic recurring underlying gap, and they're all trying to fill the gap by exporting more than they import. But it's a zero-sum game, right? For every country that's a winner, there's a country that's a loser. So in some cases, it makes the gap even worse if you're on the wrong end of that.
mm.
Um,
Is this
so
somehow, you know, uh, the United States kind of trade or economic supremacy is related to its capacity to constantly, because they're the
world
world's reserve currency, they can constantly run deficits. Is that right? Something like that?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's they're in a unique position.
Yeah.
And so, but most countries, of course, don't have the benefit of their currency
Mm,
serving as the world's reserve currency, which is, in demand um, for international transactions. So, and if they stop being the world's reserve currency, well, then, what's the fallout going to be there, right? So
Mm,
again, that's another example of something that it might help to bridge the gap for a certain period of time, but then there's always a day of reckoning.
yes.
Yeah.
Mm.
So I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add about. I mean, there are other things we could talk about, I suppose, different methods um, of maybe not bridging, but managing the gap or trying to, to put up with it, to make do. There's a lot of
Mm.
tremendous amount of energy that is involved, time and energy that's involved in resources involved in bridging the gap. So it's
And then
because if we
this
don't
is the
bridge the gap,
underlying dysfunction, isn't it? Because what we're doing is we have this abstract money system, and it seems to be the thing that dictates to our physical economic realities. And so we
mm,
have the physical economy, which is, the industrial clout, which is tremendously powerful and potentially damaging. And it's running
mm,
around trying to solve this abstract mathematical problem by, by employing people and manufacturing things that aren't necessarily useful or genuinely demanded. Whereas we could just, if we could just step back a bit and have a look at the possibility of solving the mathematical problem directly, rather than sort of distorting, having finance in the driver's seat, dictating
mm,
to the real economy, have the realities of the real economy reflected in the financial
right.
in finance. I mean, that's what really
Right.
essentially we're saying.
Yeah. So uh, Douglas Social Credit says, yes, there's a gap. I mean, it was Douglas who discovered that there was a gap. Yes, the conventional system tries to bridge the gap in these various ways that are more or less dysfunctional and not sustainable. Why don't we simply measure the gap, monetize it with debt-free credit, and distribute it to or on behalf of consumers in the form of consumer credits, dividends, and discounts?
Mm,
And do that in lieu of all these conventional methods of bridging the gap. So no more consumer credit involving the creation of new debt money, no more, private sector business expansion just for the sake of, as a
mm,
way of making the monetary system work, not because we actually need the resultant goods or services. No more trying to export more than you import. No more, government production or government services, much of which might just be make work, of dubious value and
mm,
utility. Forget about all that. Just fill the gap in the way that is efficient, effective, and just, and that brings a natural equilibrium to the system, so that whatever we produce, we can pay for in full without having to charge the credit card.
mm, mm.
I mean,
Yes,
it should be simple. So,
yeah, you would think so, but not. But alas,
no. Well, and that raises another point is that there are, of course, powerful vested interests that profit off of dysfunction. And while the present system is not operating in the common interest, it's operating in their interest. And
yes.
so they don't have any incentive to change the system in a way that would actually benefit the common individual. At least I think it's even in their interest to do it, honestly, in their long-term interest, because it would put civilization on a much sounder foundation, and the creativity and the invention and um, the well-being that would be released could only
Mm,
benefit them directly and indirectly. They would benefit from all of that as well. So it's very short-sighted that they can only see things in terms of immediate monetary and, I suppose, political power benefits. But there's always a problem with that setup when you've got a group of people who are profiting off of dysfunction, who are basically acting as parasites relative to a host, right?
mm,
Because at some point the host can't sustain the parasitism and the whole thing implodes, and both the host and the parasite kaput, right?
mm.
So, so they have to manage it, try to like get as much as they can, but without threatening the continued survival of the host. And at some point, it may not be so easy to continue on that road.
Mhm. Well, the the economy and the financial system as it is. It's a marvelous mechanism for control, isn't it?
Mm.
And I think that's fundamentally why we have what we have.
Right.
You know, and it's going to come down to the confrontation with the money power in the end, if we can get to that point.
Right. Right.
Um,
So basically what you're saying is we run the system the way we do and we put up with all this dysfunction because it offers a certain elite, oligarchic elite, control over policy, control over individual policy,
sure.
public
Yes.
policy, otherwise wouldn't enjoy.
Mm,
So there's nothing democratic about that in the authentic sense of the term,
no.
democracy.
No. We're in a muddle here for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Whereas if you fill the gap along Douglas social credit lines, you are distributing power. You're not centralizing or concentrating power. You're forever, in every economic period, you're distributing economic power, financial power to individuals, to all individuals considered as shareholders in their society. And so it's like the very opposite model, really, when
Yes.
it comes to power distribution.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. So it should be, I mean, it should be a no-brainer. Um, you know, uh, this would benefit the vast majority of the population. It actually would benefit everybody, really. Uh, but it would in a very tangible day-to-day way benefit the vast majority of the population.
Mm.
And you can't
And it
have
would
a success.
diffuse a lot of the tension that is artificially stimulated by this dysfunctional system. Like for instance, the tension between business and the consumer, or between businesses and government with taxes, and businesses and their workers and so on. A
And the
lot of these
consumer
tensions
and
are as
government.
a result. Yeah, it's a result of, like, it's kind of divide and conquer tactics as a result of this dysfunctional system that we operate.
Yeah, it
Um,
causes a tremendous amount of conflict, social conflict. And I don't know if I made this point before, and we won't develop it to any great extent now, but I also think that a lot of the social, cultural wars and battles that go on are basically, in part, a distraction from the real problem, but also are caused by the real problem because people do feel oppressed. They experience oppression because of all the artificial financial pressures that we are forced to labor under and all the problems that the present means of bridging the gap induce, inflation, both cost push and demand pull, instability, financial crises, debt slavery, goes on and on. Conflict, like you were saying before, that they're trying to figure out, okay, what is causing this? Oh, it's racial. Oh, it's gender. Oh, it's sexuality. Oh, it's gender identity. Oh, it's you go down the list of all these things. That's why we're having all these problems because this group is oppressing that group. And this is just divide and conquer because the fundamental source of the oppression has to do with the common citizen, every citizen, and a plutocratic elite who own and control the financial system and run it primarily for their own benefit at the expense of the common interest.
mm,
Douglas sometimes talked about how finance can be likened to the ticket office of a railway, and the railway being like the real economy. And under the current system, finance is in the driver's seat, finance is in control. So it would be like the ticket office dictating to the railway who can travel, under what conditions, and how much it's going to cost, etc. To the point where you might you might have a train traveling from one destination to another, and it might be half empty. And the reason it's half empty is simply because the ticket office won't distribute sufficient tickets to fill the train,
Mm.
because it's more profitable for them to sell the tickets, only half the tickets at a much higher price for those who can afford it,
Mm.
you see. So, or yeah, we'll fill the train, but you've got to do all this extra work. Maybe you need to build other train tracks, even though we don't really need other train tracks, or we need to, do other things outside of the inner logic of that particular trip in order for us to deign to condescend to give you print the extra tickets. And they're just tickets. The tickets should represent the reality. If there are 100
Yes.
seats, we need 100 tickets.
Mhm.
Not, we'll give you 60 and maybe we'll give you 40, but only if you do this, this, and this, and this, and this to benefit us, right?
Mm.
Which is basically the way the present system operates.
It's a crazy situation. I actually heard Elon Musk the other day say that labor was still the fundamental thing in the production system now. The
Really?
fundamental, yeah, which is strange
Mm.
coming from him, the big robot
Yeah.
guy.
Yeah.
You know, we can't seem to get
Well,
past these.
presumably that can be measured somehow, and I suppose depending on how you measure it, that statement might be true or false.
Mm,
I mean, certainly from Douglas's point of view, the contribution made by machines, by power-driven machinery, in terms of the actual output, would dwarf anything that labor contributes.
yes.
Right? So even if you look at what a car can do, you can go from here to Montreal, let's say, in 6 hours or so. How long would it take you to walk? Right? How many hotels would you have to stay at? How many meals would you have to eat, etc., in order to make that journey on foot?
Yeah, sure.
And so, and I mean, it's all we're speaking in analogies, but take anything that we use. What's the contribution made by machinery as opposed to the labor component, right? In
Mm,
terms of the value of what is produced, it's Douglas said that labor is more and more just a catalyst, right? It's
yes.
just to catalyze production, to oversee the machines, or to press the buttons, or whatever it is, and it's not actually doing the work, the bulk of the work.
No, the contribution of human energy is minuscule
Yeah,
compared with other forms of energy now. Of course, it has been for a long time.
and has been
Mm,
for a long time. Yeah.
mm.
So yeah, go ahead.
All right, I was just going to say, shall we leave it there?
Yeah, okay. I think we addressed that topic well. If anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to leave them on the video. And our websites are thepeoplescredit.com.au and socred.org. Please like and subscribe, and we will see you again next week.
Thanks for listening. Bye now.